The Demonology of King James by Donald Tyson. James and the Witches. The once and future King James Stuart was born June 19, 1566 at Edinburgh from the union of Mary Queen of Scots with her second husband, Henry Stuart Lord Darnley. When his mother was forced to abdicate her throne by Queen Elizabeth, James was pronounced King James the Sixth of Scotland on June 24, 1567. For the first 12 years of his life, he was not permitted to participate in state affairs, but was kept for his own security in Stirling Castle, safe from the constantly bickering Scottish fictions. Physically, he was weak and sickly, a misfortune of health that played a significant part in his tendency in later life to achieve his purposes by manipulation and deceit rather than the bold exercise of power. For the first 6 or 7 years of his life, he was unable to stand up or walk without aid. As a young man, he developed a love for horseback riding, but it was necessary that he be tied to his horse due to the weakness in his legs. And once, when he fell into a body of water while out riding, he nearly drowned because he was unable to help himself. Throughout his life, he preferred to walk leaning on the shoulder of an attendant. Weakness of the body was in part compensated for by keenness of intellect. When Sir Henry Killigrew saw that the boy in 1574 was impressed by the skill of 8-year-old James in translating Latin from French texts, from an early age he was trained by his guardians in the Protestant faith and developed an aversion for Catholicism, although this did not prevent him from sending a letter to the Pope in 1584, hinting that he might be persuaded to change his faith if it forwarded his political goals. James was already to imply friendship and favor, provided there was no actual necessity of ever giving them. There seems little doubt that James was a coward. He fought against this tendency throughout his life, but it was his nature and he could never overcome it. In 1582, he was kidnapped by a faction of Scottish nobles during the raid of Ruthven. Although he was then old enough to shave, he was so terrified of his captors that he cried like a child. Sir Thomas Lyon, one of the men keeping him hostage, gruffly told the young king it were better barons' children should Greek cry than bearded men. James parted from his captors in 1583 and began to rule his kingdom, but always remained timid. The Marquis de Fontenay, French ambassador to the Scottish court during the early part of his reign, spoke of James as coward by the violence that surrounded him. When in 1587 his mother was executed by order of Elizabeth, he made little effort to prevent it. His personal appearance and manners were not attractive. He had a tendency to bluster and make promises he had no intentions of ever fulfilling. He talked too much in a very thick Scottish accent and was pedantic and put on airs of scholarship that he did not merit. In dress, he was slovenly and unclean. His physical caresses and frequent gifts to male favorites in his court gave rise to gossip that he was homosexual. All these tendencies were strongly despised by the English people when he ascended to the throne of England in 1603 at the death of Elizabeth. But they swallowed their distaste and welcomed him in a patriarchal spirit as the only alternative to bitter civil war. In 1589, James married Anne, second daughter of Frederick II, King of Denmark. This union between the Protestant monarch and the Protestant princess generally alarmed the Catholic factions in England and Scotland, who saw that their hope for a restoration of the papacy sliding away. Until this marriage, James had done his best to maintain a cordial relationship with both the Vatican and the royal family of Spain. But this choice of a bride left no question about his religious learnings. Perhaps the only romantic and courageous attraction James ever took was to sail out to meet Anne after her ship was driven by a storm into the port of Oslo in Norway. It was there that James enjoyed his first night of connubial bliss with his 15-year-old bride. The trials of the North Berwick witches, who received this title because they were supposed to congregate in the kirk or church at North Berwick near Edinburgh in the dead of night to meet with the devil and concoct their plots, took place mainly between the years 1590 and 1592. Although the fallout of the affair dragged on for years, it marked a major turning point in the thinking of the young king. The charges against the accused included numerous attempts by magic on his life, and even one effort to kill the queen while she was on her voyage from Denmark to England. Previously, James had only feared plots by rebellious Scottish nobles that endangered his life by physical means, but now he found himself and his new bride threatened by the supernatural. James keenly interested himself in the trials and was a direct participant in much of the questioning. He mentioned in his Tolbooth speech of 1591, and it would not be excessive to say that he was the prime mover in the whole affair. Undoubtedly, he observed the torture of the accused and heard the confessions wrung from their own agonized mouth. He was gratified to learn from Agnes Sampson that the devil considered him to be his chief opponent, and it was for this reason that Satan hated him and wished to bring about his death. She testified that when the witches asked Satan why he hated the king so much, the devil replied, "By reason the king is the greatest enemy here hath in the world." By this extraordinary statement, the devil cast James into the role of an avenging knight of the Christian faith. James was fond of making reference to the warrior mounted upon a white horse, Revelation 19, verses 11 through 16, who was prophesied to descend to earth to punish the wicked in the later days, which James believed to already have arrived. As an intensely religious man and as the leader of his nation in military matters, spiritual and judicial, it would have been difficult for James to decline the role of Satan's chief advisory. He accepted it as a challenge and spent the better part of the next 4 decades trying to do it honor. Since this mythic figure upon his white horse is so central to the view James held of his own crusade against the witchcraft, it is worth quoting the relevant verses from the King James Bible version of the text. "And I saw heaven open, and behold a white horse, and he that sat upon him was called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he doeth judge and make war. His eyes were as flame of fire, and on his head were many crowns, and he had a name written that no man knew but he himself. And he was clothed with a vesture dipped in blood, and his name is called the Word of God. And the armies which were in heaven followed him upon white horses, clothed in fine linen, white and clean. And out of his mouth goeth a sharp word, that with it he will smite the nations, and he shall rule them with a rod of iron. And he treadeth upon the winepress of the fierceness and wrath of Almighty God." Can there be any doubt that James saw in the brave knight on the white horse with many crowns a reflection of himself, or that the sharp sword that proceeded from his mouth was for James the book Demonology and the 1604 witchcraft statute of England? He viewed himself as a general in the army of Christ, clothed in fine linen, white and clean. It must have struck James as significant in the light of this biblical passage that the accused North Berwick witches sought to bring about his death by procuring a piece of linen that he had soiled, so as to use his bodily excretions in their magic against him. James was a strong believer in the supernatural and the power of magic, but he ascribed all working of magic to the devil. He did not recognize what Cornelius Agrippa called natural magic, or what was sometimes termed white magic, as a lawful activity. The efficacy of herbs and stones, was either an inherent part of their composition, and so a matter of medicine and science, or was it infused into them by the power of Satan in order to deceive those who used them for healing or other purposes? For James, there was no such thing as an occult forces that could be used for benevolent purposes. On one hand, there was the power of God, which had ceased to produce prophecies or miracles since the time of Christ, and on the other hand, there was the power of Satan, which waxed stronger in the modern age than at any other time in history due to the imminence of the end of the world, and was responsible for all marvelous effects that were other than natural. The supernatural must have terrified him at least as much as the political intimidations used by his Scottish nobles in an effort to know his spiritual enemies as well as he knew his temporal foes. He made an extensive study of the available literature on the subjects of magic, witchcraft, and demons. It is tempting to assume that his reading was wider than it was deep. Summers wrote despairingly about the degree of learning he displayed in his treatise on witchcraft. In many passages, King James has borrowed from the continental demonologist, whom had read with more diligence than Cumin. For his zeal and dexterous learning, one feels that there is something just a little superficial in his grasp of more scholarly writers and theologians. In the king's defense, he had been present during the actual questioning of the accused North Berwick witches and had heard their testimony, so James' knowledge of the subject was not entirely theoretical as the knowledge of his critic Summers. In any case, James was hardly about to instruct his readers in the final points of practical necromancy and witchcraft, regardless of how much theoretical knowledge he might himself possess. The purpose of his book, which is arose as a direct visceral reaction to the North Berwick trials and the supposed plots against his life by magic, was to increase the persecution of witches in Scotland and England. Everything in the work is tailored to achieve this end. Shortly after assuming the English throne in 1603, James ordered a new edition of his book published in London so that he could extend his crusade against witchcraft into England. A Dutch translation was published in 1604, and Latin editions came off the presses in Hanover in 1604 and 1607. A year after his coronation, James succeeded in getting the 1563 witchcraft statute that had been enforced during most of the long reign of Elizabeth abolished, and a new statute erected in its place that contains harsher and broader punishment for witches and practitioners of magic. So keen was James on this matter that his reinterpretation of the witchcraft laws went to the House of the Lords for consideration only 8 days after the first sitting of Parliament of his reign as the English king, and passed on the first reading. The main difference between the law of Elizabeth and that of James concerned what should be the focus of the punishment. Under Elizabeth, those who practiced witchcraft and sorcery were subject to the most severe punishment only if they were found to have used these arts to commit murder or other injuries. It was the crimes in which witchcraft had been employed that were the primary object of punishment, not the practice of witchcraft itself, which was the secondary concern. James wanted the practice of any form of magic punished severely, regardless of whether it was used to commit injuries to others, because he held all such practices to be trafficking with the devil whom he believed to be the source of the efficacies for all magic. Under the law of Elizabeth, anyone who bewitched another without causing his death was subject to a penalty of 1 year in prison. A law of James made the same crime punishable by hanging. Minor infractions such as using divination to locate stolen property, making love potions, or damaging property such as laming a cow or causing hail to flatten a crop in the field were still punishable by a year in prison and a term in the pillory, as they had been under the old law. James caused it to become a felony to invoke any evil spirit or to have any dealings with an evil spirit. This meant that to keep a familiar spirit in the form of a cat, dog, rabbit, or other was punishable by death. The devil was thought to mark those with whom he made a pact. To be found to have a witch mark anywhere on the body was also enough evidence of consultation with an evil spirit to be punishable by death. Hence, the vigorous questioning by the courts about familiars and the intensity of the search for the witch mark. The statute of James made it a crime punishable by hanging to invoke, consult, covenant with, entertain, employ, feed, or reward any evil spirit for any purpose. 2. Take any dead body or any part of a dead body for use in any witchcraft, sorcery, charm, or enchantment. 3. Practice any form of witchcraft, enchantment, charm, or sorcery in which any person is killed, destroyed, wasted, consumed, pinned, or lamed in the body or any part of the body. 4. Aid, abet, or counsel others in any of the above acts. The statute also made it a crime punishable by 1 year in prison to use witchcraft, enchantment, charms, or sorcery to locate any treasure of gold or silver in the earth or other hidden places. 2. Locate any lost or stolen goods or things. 3. Intend to provoke any person to unlawful love. 4. Destroy, waste, or impair any chattel or goods for another person. 5. Attempt without success to hurt or destroy any person in the body. All of the offenses punishable by a year in prison on the first offense were felonies on the second commission and punishable by hanging. On the matter of capital punishment for witchcraft, in England it was hanging, the same as for other common felonies such as murder. In Scotland, witchcraft was punished by burning, but the custom was to strangle the condemned witch at the stake before lighting the fire, and in this way to lessen the suffering of the witch. This was done as an act of mercy when the witch confessed to her supposed crimes and did not recant the confession once the torture used to extract the confession had been halted. If the witch retracted the confession, the mercy of strangulation might be withdrawn and she might be burned alive, though this barbarity was uncommon. In practice, the English courts carried on much as they had before the passage of the witch statute of James in meting out the death penalty. It is usually only given to those who have been convicted of causing the death of another person with witchcraft or necromancy. For example, even though it was a capital offense murder, the new law to dig up a corpse for the use in magic, no one was ever put to death for this crime. There were exceptions. In 1645, 7 women were hanged at Chelmsford for entertaining evil spirits, which is to say, for keeping familiars. What the law did accomplish was the more frequent and vigorous prosecution of accusations of witchcraft in England and later in America. The Salem witch trials were carried out under the statute of James, which was not abolished until 1736. During the early part of his reign as English monarch, James was revered in his persecution of witchcraft as he had been while living in Scotland. But as the years passed, his favor began to wane. He was able to prove to his satisfaction that several of those who had accused others of witchcraft had been lying. In 1605, James paid £300 to Reverend Samuel Harsnett to question a 14-year-old girl, Annie Gunter, who had accused 3 women in Abingdon of witchcraft. The girl admitted under the sharp questioning of Harsnett that she had only been pretending to fall into fits and had falsely accused the women. While traveling north in 1618, James stopped at Leicester with 6 women were due to be hanged as witches on the evidence of a 12-year-old boy, John Smith, who claimed that his convulsions were caused by their bewitchment of him. 9 other women had already been executed on the last testimony. James examined the boy and determined to his satisfaction that his fits were nothing but fraud. The women were freed, and Chief Justice Sir Edward Coke, who had presided over the trial, was disgraced. In 1621, James questioned yet another youthful accuser, a girl out of the town of West Ham in Essex, now a part of Greater London, named Catherine Malpass, who pretended to be the subject to fits of demonic possessions and accused 2 women of bewitching her. Since James had personally witnessed cases of possessions, he was difficult to fool. A woman was made to confess that she had taught the girl to simulate the fits so that she could charge money of those who came to watch her convulsions. This and similar evidence of deceptions both enraged James and shook his confidence in his beliefs. It is asserted by some historians that James went so far in his later years as to completely repudiate the reality of witchcraft. Robbins quoted Thomas Fuller's and asserting in his Church History of Britain that James grew his first diffident of, said that flatly to deny the workings of witches and devils as but falsehood and delusions. This seems unlikely in view of the strength of these convictions, particularly since the intensity of his religious faith never wavered. Whatever his own attitude, changed or not, during his last 9 years as king, it is recorded that only 5 convicted witches were executed. Viewed as a whole, the persecution of witches under his rules, though more vigorous than it had been during the reign of Elizabeth, was not so severe as might appear from the tenor of his books and his statute. Montague Summers observed that there are only 50 cases of witches having been executed in England during the entire reign of King James. Summers wrote, "It would appear that the popular ideas concerning the Holocaust in the reign of James are anything but historically exact, and instead of shuddering at the large numbers who perished, we may well be surprised that the executions in England were so few." Only 15 executions in England, yet many more women were tried, and even those who did not suffer imprisonment as a result of a guilty verdict had to face the humiliation of their bodies shaved of all of their hair, and a search made of their private parts for the witch mark. The censure and condemnation of their family, friends, and neighbors, and worst of all, the protracted ordeal of torture used on them in an effort to extract a confession. It is probable that the number of executions would have been much higher had James been able to freely work his will during the early part of his reign, but his personal crusade against witchcraft was in part inhibited by the conservative nature of English common laws, which is slow to change its ways of doing things, and perhaps also by the common sense of the many judges. One more incident must be related of James before we leave his life and proceed to a close examination of the North Berwick affair. Margaret Murray related in God of the Witches that as James lay on his deathbed, An attempt was made in his bedchamber by his attendants to lessen his pain by transferring it into the body of an animal. A young pig was for this purpose dressed in the clothing of a human baby. One of the ladies of the court played the part of its mothers, and the Duchess of Buckingham assumed the role of midwife. A gentleman who was dressed in the robes of bishop read a service of baptism, while the Duke of Buckingham and other nobles played part of the pig's godfathers. The pig was baptized, then chased out of the room. It may be assumed that James was in a very bad state, and at that point perhaps not even conscious of his surroundings, yet if he did retain any of his mental faculties, what must have been the thought of performance of what was clearly a blasphemous ritual of witchcraft for his personal benefit. Was he inwardly horrified by what his concerned attendants were doing in their efforts to lessen his suffering, or was he hypocritical enough to justify it in some way in his own mind, even though it was opposed to everything he had ever written or said concerning witchcraft? History has not recorded his last thoughts, only the incredible irony of the performance of a magic ritual over the deathbed of a man who all his life was steadfast in his loathing and rejection of anything remotely connected with the art of magic. The North Berwick witches, the incidents that formed the beast for the North Berwick witch trials, which are partially detailed in the tract news from Scotland, may have been instigated insofar as they may have any factual basis by the determination of James to wed Anne of Denmark. Among the charges against the witches is that they tried to sink the ship carrying James to Denmark to meet with his future bride, and also the ship bringing Anne to England. Two of the items filed against John Fian, one of the supposed leaders of the plot, read as follows. Item: for the raising of the winds at the king's passing to Denmark, and for the sending of a letter to Martin Lincoln in Leith to exact effect, bidding her to meet him at the rest on the sea within 5 days, where Satan delivering a cat out of his hand to Robert Grierson, and gave the word to cast the same in the sea Hola. And after, beginning mounted in a ship and drunk like unto others, where Satan said, you shall sink the ship, like as they thought they did. For assembling himself with Satan at the king's returning from Denmark, where Satan promised to raise a mist and cast the king's majesty in England, and for performing thereof the hook, a thing like to soup ball, which appeared that the John said like a wisp, and cast the same in the sea, which caused a vapor and reek to rise. The charges against Agnes Sampson accuse her of sending a letter to another witch, ordering her to warn the rest of the sisteries to raise the wind this day at elevation hours, to stay the queen's coming in Scotland. At the same time that women and men were being accused in Scotland of trying to prevent the union of James and Anne, similar accusations were being made in Denmark. The spy lord Bergley in Copenhagen wrote to him in a letter dated July 23, 1590, that the Admiral Peter Monk in Denmark had caused 5 or 6 witches to be taken in Copenhagen upon suspicion that their witchcraft that had stated the Queen of Scots' voyage into Scotland, and sought to have stayed likewise the king's return. A woman named Anna Coldings was interrogated, and under the fear of greater tortures was forced to give the names of 5 other women, one of them being the wife of the burgomaster of Copenhagen. Eventually all were induced to confess to raising a storm to sink Anne's ship, and of having sent demons to climb the keel of the vessel and pull it under the waves. It is a curious coincidence that the same storm that held back Queen Anne from initially sailing to Scotland also sank a ferry traveling between Burntisland and Leith with Lady Mary Melville of Garthgach abroad. Lady Mary was the wife of Sir Andrew Melville, the master of the household affairs of King James, and was traveling to meet Anne upon her arrival in Scotland. Concerning this tragedy of September 1589, Sir James Melville wrote in his memoirs, "She being willing to mock diligence, walked not stay for the storm, to sail the ferry, when the vehement storm drave a ship upon the sailboat, and drowned the gentlemen and all the persons except twa." Why this sudden fury to prevent the king from bringing his new bride back to Scotland? Margaret Murray, Montague Somers, and others have speculated that the purported attempts by the accused witches to kill James and Anne were motivated by the royal ambitions of Francis Stuart, the Earl of Bothwell. His title descended through his mother, Jane Hepburn, who was the sister of the former Earl of Bothwell that had married Mary, Queen of Scots, but his claim to the throne was from his father, Lord John Stuart, the illegitimate son of James V of Scotland. For so long as James remained without an heir, Bothwell could make a plausible claim for the Scottish crown at his death, but once James married and had children, that claim was void. There was some evidence to support this theory of Bothwell's involvement in the North Berwick's witches. In her confession, Agnes Sampson revealed that she had constructed a wax image of James, saying, "This is King James the Sixth, ordinate to be consumed at the instance of a nobleman Francis Earl Bothwell." Murray and Somers both believed that Bothwell played the part of the devil at the Sabbath meetings of the witches, and it is true that in later years during the exile in Italy, Bothwell kept the reputation of being a powerful magician. This fanciful theory depends on a rather startling preposition that prior of the exposure of the plots of the witches, Bothwell was the active head of a large coven of witches accustomed to meet at the North Berwick Kirk and elsewhere in the dead of the night, where he dressed up in costume and played the part of Satan. If such nocturnal meetings took place, they must have been executed with a mastery of stealth and guile, since this considerable undertaking of manpower and resources passed unnoticed in the small, closely knit communities near the church where the members of the coven lived. James despised Bothwell for his pretensions to the succession. In a speech to the Scottish Parliament in 1592, he denounced Bothwell and said of him that he was but a bastard and could claim no title to the crown. Margaret Murray, witch cult in Western Europe, Murray pointed out that this was not accurate. Bothwell's father was a bastard, but Bothwell himself had been born of legal marriage, and in any case, Bothwell's father had been granted a letter of legitimacy by Mary, Queen of Scots. Though he felt contempt for this upstart, James was deadly afraid of him. When Bothwell came to Holyrood Castle in July of 1593, seeking a pardon from the king for the crimes he stood accused of, he was admitted directly and without warning into the king's bedchamber by a lady of the court, where he caught James in the middle of dressing. The terrified James tried to run and hide in his wife's bedchamber, but the men who accompanied Bothwell blocked his path of escape and locked the door to prevent him from leaving before Bothwell had his say. James asked them their purpose. Came they seek his life? Let them take it. They will not get his soul. If James considered Bothwell as a leader of witches who conspired to bring about his death, and a powerful necromancer in league with Satan against him, little wonder the sudden apparition of Bothwell in his bedchambers gave James a nasty turn. The whole business of the North Berwick witches started innocently enough with the uncanny healing abilities of the maidservant named Gilly Duncan. Although she had never been a healer before, she began to go to those who were sick or infirm to try to help them. Her neighbors took notice of this admirable charity when her efforts suddenly began to succeed with astonishing frequency. Rather than praise Duncan for her good works and count themselves fortunate to know her, they began to murmur behind her back that she must be accomplishing miraculous cures with means that were other than natural. Duncan had the misfortune to work for David Seaton, the deputy bailiff of the town. He decided to question his maid as to where she had acquired the skill to work such amazing cures, and why she was in the habit lately of stealing out of his house to sleep elsewhere every other night. It was impossible not to speculate about the personal motives that prompted Seaton to question Duncan. Did he have some affection for her that was not returned? Did he take this excuse to ferret out information about his imagined rival? Or was Seaton upset with her because he thought her night wanderings were bringing scandal upon his household? Whatever his original suspicions, her stubborn silence enraged him. He had her held down and applied a set of thumb screws to her fingers in an effort to compel her to speak. When she still did not answer to his satisfaction, he bound her head and wrung it with a rope, a popular form of torture in the 16th century. Duncan still refused to say what Seaton wanted her to say, so he decided to probe her for a witch mark, which was considered to be a sure sign of a witch. A witch mark is a small mole or other skin blemished and sensitive to pain that is supposedly impressed onto the body of a witch at the time of her initiation into the craft by Satan himself. The way of locating it was to take a long, thick needle and thrust it deeply and successively into all moles, scars, or other marks on the skin, presumably with the unfortunate individual blindfolded, until one was located that did not produce a shriek of pain. He found what he was looking for in the front of her throat, and this apparent evidence broke her will and induced her to confess that she was a witch and that all her cures had been the work of Satan. Duncan was cast into prison, where she shortly began to name the names of her supposed accomplices in witchcraft. They were not all of low station in life. Agnes Simpson, the key figure among the women accused, who was known locally as the wise wife of Nether Keith, was a mature, educated woman said to be grave in her manner and settled in her answers to her inquisitors. Effie McCaolan was the daughter of Lord Clifton Hall and a woman of some social stature. John Fionn was a schoolmaster. Barbara Napier was described as a woman of good family. These four appear to have been the leaders in the affair, or at least were nominated as its leaders by James and the magistrates, and were not in a position to decline the elevation. As more individuals were implicated and questioned, two threads emerged. One was the standard fantastic tale of malicious acts of magic worked at the behests of the devil against ordinary townsfolk in the region around Edinburgh. The other was the plot to assassinate James and his wife. It is impossible to know how much truth is contained in either thread of confessions, although the interrogations of the accused have provided boundless matter for speculation. It will probably never be definitely proven either that there was any witchcraft going on, or that there was ever a witch plot to kill James, since the confessions were extracted under torture or threat of torture. Not a word of them can be trusted. It may be useful to gain some notion of how local was the affair of the North Berwick witches. Most of the communities involved were on the same side of the Firth of Forth as Edinburgh, as were within walking distance from each other. The town of Tranent, where the unfortunate Gilly Duncan was tortured by her master, was about 8 or 9 miles from Edinburgh. Leith was only a mile or 2 away. Salt Pans, where John Fian taught school, also sometimes called Salt Preston, where was Preston Pans is today, and some 5 or 6 miles from the city, the notorious North Berwick Kirk occupied a headland around 20 miles from Edinburgh. All these places are on the southern shore of the Firth of Forth, Kinghorn, and Birchesland, from where the ferry boat sailed that was supposed to have been sunk by the witches with a loss of 60 lives, are both located opposite Leith across the Firth. The whole affair might be said to have occurred in the backyard of the king, which may be one reason he took so active an interest. The heart of the testimony concerned a Sabbath meeting that took place in 1590 on Halloween at or around midnight at the North Berwick Kirk. Here the witches, drunk and merry, after riding down the Firth on their civvies and dancing on the green outside the church to the sound of a Jew harp played by Gilly Duncan, entered the church to convene with the devil, who stood in the pulpit dressed in a black hat and black gown, surrounded by burning black candles. In Melville Memoirs, he is described as terrible in appearance, with a nose like the beak of an eagle, great burning eyes, hairy hands and legs, with claws upon his hands, and feet like those of a griffin. In a low voice, the devil called the roll, naming each witch by his or her name, with the exception of one named Robert Grierson, who was quite annoyed when the devil addressed him by his real name, since it had been agreed that they only use nicknames, his being Rob the Royal. The devil asked the witches what evil they had worked in his name, and after hearing their deeds, they discussed their efforts to bewitch a wax image of King James to bring about his death. The devil instructed them to dig up 4 corpses, 2 outside the church in the graveyard, and 2 that had been buried inside the building in vaults. From the corpse, they removed the joints of the fingers, toes, and knees, and divided the parts up between them. The devil told them to let the joints dry, then powder them, and use the powder in the works of evil magic. At one point during the evening, they all kissed the devil's bare buttocks as a homage to him. His skin was described as being cold and as hard as iron. The account of this Halloween meeting, contained in somewhat disordered confessions of the accused, has provided the prototype for countless subsequent descriptions of the witches' Sabbath. Many of its elements are mentioned in earlier confessions of those accused of witchcraft in different European nations, but the North Berwick Court Sabbath is perhaps the most complete and well-rounded of the descriptions. The judicial proceedings began in 1950 and extended for 3 years to the trial of the Earl of Bothwell in August 1593. There is some evidence that they dragged on even longer than this. In all, some 70 persons were implicated. Margaret Murray wrote 39 persons were involved in the affair, a number she perceived as significant because it is 3 times 13, and 13 is sometimes supposed to be the number of the members in a witch coven. Murray also wrote that only 4 were ever tried. Witch cult in Western Europe, page 50. Neither of these numbers is accurate. There were various gradations of involvement. Not all those accused were arrested, and not all those arrested were convicted. The exact numbers of persons arrested in the affair remains unknown, but the initial round of arrests took place in the months of November and December of 1590, and the trials began in 1591. The execution of justice was capricious. A few of the accused fled to England. The king instructed the same David Seaton, who had started the whole affair, to follow after them and recapture them. At least one woman was identified and imprisoned in England, causing James to go to great lengths to have her extradited to Scotland, where she was tortured, and gave the names of more supposed accomplices. James' fiancé also escaped for a brief time and tried to hide himself near his home in Salt Pans, but was recaptured and was executed on Castle Hill in Edinburgh in January 1591. After the most terrible tortures that James could conceive to use upon him, Theon was killed in the usual way by strangulation at the stake immediately before his body was burned. John Grierson, who had his name spoken aloud at the Halloween Sabbath, died in prison. Agnes Sampson, who undoubtedly was a witch in the more conventional sense of the one who predicts the future and makes magic charms, was strangled and then burned to ashes on Castle Hill. Barbara Napier may or may not have been a witch, but she certainly led a charmed life. When her stake was prepared for her execution on May 11, 1591, and the townspeople had assembled to watch her be strangled and burned, her friends made the claim that she was pregnant, and her execution was delayed until this could be demonstrated to be either true or false. Her jury had refused to find her guilty of treason against the king on the grounds of insufficient evidence, which estranged James and led him to declare her verdict an assize of error. He called for a new trial against her and started legal proceedings against the jury members themselves. His strident address to the jury had been preserved and is known as his toll booth speech because it occurred at the toll booth building in Edinburgh, where the law courts were located. There is no court of Barbara Napier has ever been executed, so it may be that after the elapse of time, the wrath of the king cooled, or her friends were able to provide reasons for him to mitigate his persecution of this woman. While Effie McCallion discovered that her 6 lawyers were no help in her defense, she also tried the pregnancy ploy, but with less success than Barbara Napier. McCallion was due to be burned alive on June 19, 1591, but when she declared that she was with child, her execution was delayed. She could not have been very convincing since she was executed on June 25th, only a week after making her plea. There may have been a last-minute mitigation in the severity of her punishment, since contemporary records show that McCallion was not burned alive, but was strangled first in the usual manner for executing witches. Just before being strangled, McCallion made a statement in the Spectators declaring that she was innocent of all the crimes charged against her. There can be little doubt in the view of her persecution of Bothwell by James that the king firmly believed Bothwell to be the leader in the North Berwick affair. On April 17, 1591, Bothwell confronted the king and his council and demanded to know what James intended to charge him with. Robert Bowles wrote the meeting to the Lord Burleigh. The king answered with practice to have taken his life. Bothwell asked if he would lay any other matter than that only. The king said it sufficed and willed him to clear himself thereof. In May of 1591, the king began to actively work to have Bothwell tried for witchcraft and high treason. On May 9th, Bothwell was held in Edinburgh's castle for conspiracy, the king's death by sorcery. On June 25th, a proclamation was issued against Bothwell, accusing him of consultation with necromancers, witches, and Utheres, wicked and ungodly persons, bathed with and within the century for bereaving of his highness Leif. The king was unable to muster enough support to have Bothwell, who was a powerful man, put on trial, so he sent Bothwell out of Scotland. In the spring of 1592, Bothwell sent a letter to the ministry of defending himself against the rumors of charging him gathering over his head like a thundercloud, but the king was not to be denied. The next year in August, Bothwell was finally tried. Most of his evidence against him came from the accusations of a minor courtier and would-be necromancer named Richard Graham. When the defense was able to demonstrate that Graham had never accused Bothwell of anything until after threatened with torture and execution for witchcraft, and that he was promised his release and continuing protection if he spoke against his master, Graham's testimony was discredited. This coupled with the testimony of many accused of the witchcraft in North Berwick affair, that they knew nothing of Bothwell other than his reputation as a man of noble character, procured Bothwell's acquittal. The North Berwick affair exerted a profound influence in shaping laws against witchcraft and the attitudes of the general population of Scotland, England, and New England toward witches and magic for more than a century. Its influence was not finally lifted until the repeal of the witch statute of James in 1736. It is impossible to understand the character of James I without knowing how deeply shaken he was by the supposed magical plots on his life at the time of his marriage. His reaction to alleged statement by the devil in the North Berwick church that James was greatest foe was to cast himself into the role of the White Knight of God, who dispensed the wrath of heaven against the wicked, using as his weapon the power of the word.